Hi, welcome everyone to today's seminar, and increasingly so as the weather stays good. It's really good to see people coming out here to talk on a Friday afternoon. So thank you for your time. Before I introduce our speaker today, as I mentioned, we've still got a couple more talks coming up in the series. Most of them are Friday 4:15. So next week we've got Rachel Carmenta from the University of East Anglia on conservation in a tele-coupled world, the framework thinking about international connections in conservation. A week after, we have Tom Harwood from PCI on biodiversity and big data. And then another event, which is not here, but linked to the series, is on July the 11th at the Natural History Museum. We have a debate on holistic grazing as a catalyzed by a tool for mitigating climate change. And this is between George Monbiot and Alan Savory. That's at the Natural History Museum. But I think it's sold out in person possibly, but we already had 2,000 registrations online. Oh, wow. So it's going to be quite a big event. So you might be interested in that debate. It's getting a lot of attention as well. To what extent grazing can be a climate change solution. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Rob Salguero-Gómez, and many of you know him. But a varied bio, which I'll try and half remember. He did his PhD in Pennsylvania, and then has been around the place in the Max Planck Institute, and did a postdoc with Hugh Possum in Australia, and then was at Sheffield and as an independent research fellow that he moved here, and is now associate professor in the biology department. So thank you, Rob. I look forward to finding out what you've been up to.
Thank you. Oh wow, clapping and everything. How exciting! That must have been for you, not for me. So thank you everybody for coming in person. I realize I may be the last thing in between you and a lovely weekend. So I'm trying to keep you as engaged as possible. And part of it will be asking you quite a few questions at the beginning, but I'll try to make it short and sweet to the extent that I may be able to. Is this thing working? I can just go next. Is there something that I can do about that in the meantime? Well, the IT is perhaps collaborating. I'll tell you something that my research group in the biology department, 2 blocks over, is really interested in, and that is determining the Guinness World Record holders across the tree of life, both within the plant and the animal kingdom for the last 15 years, but hopefully in the coming years as well within microbes.
Eric is there.
No worries. That's absolutely fine. So we have got a pretty good understanding within plants and animals of what some of the fastest growing species are. E. coli, for instance, can double its size within 20 minutes, which is quite remarkable. The bowhead whale puts on the equivalent to a full adult size every day before it achieves adulthood. Every day, 80 kilos. And then for those of you who might be a bit plant phobe, plants are amazing. They're super interesting. They have got really interesting demographies and ecologies. And one of the things that I find fascinating is that there are some plant species like bamboos that can put up almost 1 meter in height per day. Let that sink in just for a second. Per day. Isn't that impressive? Now, if I ask you about what are some of the oldest species across the tree of life, this is an area of research within my group. If you belong to my group and if you're here, please don't answer that question. You should know the answer to that by now. Everybody else, throw names at me. What are some of the oldest species that we know of?
Trees.
Trees. Any specific tree or group of trees that may come to mind? Bristlecone pine is definitely among them. Anything else? Aspen, yeah, definitely, yeah. Yeah, oh my goodness, it's like you saw my presentation before coming. Introducing Pando, which is a clone. Through isotope analysis and geological models, scientists have estimated that that creature, which is in fact a full forest, has lived that many years at least. We also have got bristlecone pines, some of which the most adult individuals were already adults by the time that the first pharaoh unified the kingdom of Egypt back 3,000 years ago. And a couple of years ago, this beautiful creature made the cover of Nature as one of the longest lived animals that we know of, between 300, 500 years, having to wait 120 some years before it can become mature. Just wait that long until you can actually get your driver's license. It's something quite impressive, really. If you're interested in some of the research that my group has done, you're very welcome to check out some of the outreach components that the previous project brought together in collaboration with the Museum of Natural History at Oxford. Now, if I ask you, what about the most resilient? So if I ask you the fastest, you probably could guess. The oldest, you definitely did. What about the most resilient species? What comes to mind? Tardigrades. Did you see my presentation before I came? Tardigrades definitely among them. They're known to be able to carry on their life cycle in a full vacuum and to be able to reproduce in space. Anything else?
Okay.
Archaea are really tough organisms in general. Yes. What else? Rotifers have got a fantastic life cycle. So obviously, I'm talking to a very well-read audience in what comes to resilience. Here are some of the examples: tardigrades, camels, the Rose of Jericho that has got a pretty impressive ability of resuming life after up to 20 years of complete droughts, and many of the other species that you mentioned before. Now, which of those ones is more resilient? If I ask you which of these three species can grow to an older age, that's pretty clear because they have got the same units. Which of those three species, and many of the ones that you have cited, is more resilient? Difficult, right? And the question you should be asking back at me is resilient to what? So the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines resilience as, I'm not going to read it out for you, you have the definition there. The first written definition of resilience that I have been able to put my hands on goes back to over 100 years ago. And it has to do with pulmonary resilience, lung resilience. And this is unfortunately a topic that I have become quite intimately acquainted with just 3.5 weeks ago. So 3.5 weeks ago, I was a stable system on my way from Pembroke College. Those are my lungs, and that's my bike. And I came across a disturbance, in fact, two disturbances, rain and a brick wall. If I had displayed full resistance, I would have remained at equilibrium. Unfortunately, I didn't. So that resulted in quite a few scratches in the bike. It wasn't even mine, it was my wife. And a bit more danger, a bit more scratches, 2 fractured ribs and a punctured and collapsed lung. That's not my lung, by the way, but that's what a collapsed lung looks. And if you haven't had the pleasure, I do not recommend it. What was interesting to me, though, is that within a week, I was pretty much off of all the hard drugs they gave me for painkillers. And I felt like I walked back to the bathroom, which will be short of 5 meters from my bedroom, didn't leave me breathless again. So it showed an incredible amount of resilience, not resistance, but a fast recovery. The ribs continue to be painful, in case you're wondering, but the lung, I have an X-ray next week, so they'll tell me if it's fully expanded. But it's been fantastic to see that an organ that is fundamental has the ability to bounce back so quickly. So that brings 2 really key concepts in the world of ecological resilience. One is resistance, which I unfortunately did not display. The other one is recovery, which I think I'm very much on my way. The ribs are still complaining every now and then, but the lung seems to be doing okay. The importance about resilience is quite, it's everywhere, really. You can read it on a daily basis online, in the newspaper. It motivates a lot of what we actually do within the Leverhulme Center that Jatinder directs. And it's definitely a main focus in a lot of the conservation actions that organizations, both global and regional, now carry on. To such an extent that the UN, for instance, has stopped recommending conserving single species, and instead, it's moved on to recommending preserving the resilience of ecological systems. Out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG, that many show the word resilience explicitly. And the other ones, I could argue, show it implicitly as well. And as I mentioned before, we now have got a new Leverhulme Center for Nature Resilience, I would argue, because recovery is part of that. However, resilience is messy. As you saw just a few slides ago, you weren't quite able to tell me, is the Rose of Jericho more resilient than a camel or a tardigrade? Since the very inceptions of ecological resilience back in the 1970s by Hollin, we ecologists have had many arguments, many of which have remained largely unsolved. And this is just two examples. One making a point about what do we mean when we talk resilience, and the other one, how can we actually quantify, let alone compare resilience? So the most classical view on resilience is the definition of engineering resilience, which is very much applied to ecology still. And the two key concepts within resilience is that if you have got a system, the black ball, that may be at equilibrium, a force, a disturbance can come and displace it. How far, it will depend on the intensity of the force, the intensity of the disturbance, and also the landscape upon which it's faced. If the ball is at the very valley of a really acute valley, then any force won't manage to displace it too much. So what this concept shows is that how resilient an organism or a system can be is both dependent on the type of the disturbance, but also the environment in which it lives. But this system only recognizes two main components for resilience: resistance, that is the ability to remain put, and recovery, that is how quickly, once you don't remain put, once you fail to resist, how quickly do you go back to the same point? We, of course, know that ecological systems don't quite behave like that. Very often you push an ecological system away from its equilibrium and it never comes back. So 20 years ago, more or less, came about the concept of stable states. So any system can actually have more than a stable state. Any system can actually have more than a valley. And the question there is, how much energy does a disturbance need to have to push it away onto the next valley? And if that valley is not of my liking, say, if that's not where I want that system to be as a conservation manager, what do I need to do to push it back up to the original point? So in ecological resilience, we're interested both in resistance recovery, but also the ability to transition, which takes us to talk about tipping points and thresholds. These concepts have been very much applied in the world of community resilience, whereby you have got a system that through time, the system will be the gray ball, by the way, through time in position H, that system may be affected by a disturbance called a thunder. That system may go down in terms of whatever quality is that you're interested in. It may be concentration of nitrogen, it may be carbon sequestration, it may be number of species, right? That system is pushed away from the stable state, and it might come back to equilibrium eventually. So it goes through a transient phase, a disturbed phase. And it might go back to the same equilibrium, or it might go to a different equilibrium. Examples include eutrophication, whereby you can have two sister lakes. One receives a pretty significant pulse of nitrogen, and the system flips completely from a pristine lake to a lake that is mono-dominated by algae. Coming back from that mono-dominated lake to a lake that is quite diverse is actually really difficult. And ecologists have spent years and decades trying to figure out the mathematics to try to predict through what pathway do I go back in a way that is least expensive. The ability to go from A to B and then return from B to A through a different pathway, which drives us crazy because it's super difficult to quantify, is called hysteresis. And ecological systems are very much dictated by that property. Across biological levels of organization, attention to resilience has been very much focused on communities and landscapes. So what you can see here is a cumulative curve of papers that I was able to identify from ISI Web of Science from the 1975s, and as a function of whether they use the word resilience or ent, and then ecology, and then whether they were focusing at the ecosystem in purple, community, population, or individual level in yellow. And just as a benchmark, you can see the total number of papers in ecology. So what you can see is that all of them have been growing exponentially. Notice that the scale as well, please, on the y-axis. But that community and ecosystem resilient research has been growing much faster. And it's only been in the last few years, really, that research in individual and population resilience has really started to attract more attention. So what I conclude from here is that resilience has attracted a lot of attention in ecology, but we're really lacking the biological levels of organization from which we can start to link processes to mechanisms. Adding insult to injury, the few papers that do operate at the population in orange or individual level resilience don't really cross taxonomic or biological frontiers. So this is a Venn diagram of the same subset of papers that have focused on ecosystem, community, population, or individuals. The areas where the two circles overlap correspond to papers that were evaluating integration. And you don't see any overlap across three of the bubbles, let alone 4. Okay? So there's little integration, and most of the research in ecological resilience occurs in the purples and the reds, ecosystem and community, respectively. So what I'm going to attempt to do today is to walk you through some of the research that we have been doing in my group, most of which has had to do with individual level resilience and population level resilience, and then tell you about some of the more incipient research that we're currently carrying out, which has to do with community level research. So a lot of people in my group are demographers. We enjoy a good equation, but we also admit that equations tend to put off quite a few people. So I'm going to try to break it down to the minimal amount of components that you're going to need today. And what you're going to need today is to realize that population ecologists need to identify traits of individuals that best predict the rates of survival and reproduction. Why survival and reproduction? Because that's what is necessary, at least in a closed population, for the population to grow or to go extinct. Okay? So imagine that you have a population in Tempe, say a population of blue tits out in, or long-tail tits in White and Woods, for which we can characterize the individuals based on the eye state. Call that the length of the wings, for instance. It just so happens that the length of the wings is a really good predictor of survival and reproduction. Okay? We have got the distribution of the individuals maybe last year, and we have got the distribution of the individuals the next year as well. Okay, 2 key properties within that distribution. We know the structure, which is the shape of the curve, and we know the total size of the population, which is the area underneath. So S, structure, capital N, size. So we can actually build a demographic model that allows us to link how traits of individuals contribute through their heterogeneity to survival and to reproduction. And from that, we're going to build a framework to predict resilience at the individual at the demographic level. You may be wondering, what is the eye state? So I'll give you an example, right? So the tail, the length of the wing, but there's many, many more examples. Within the plant kingdom, for instance, we tend to use the DBH, diameter at breast height, if you do forestry ecology, or the height or width, whatever have you. But it doesn't have to be something morphologic. It can be something biochemical. So research that we've been doing with Tom Walker, among others, relates metabolomes, the predecessors of hormones in plants and animals, to rates of survival and reproduction. So you can really get quite mechanistic. And research that many other folks in my group are doing have looked at satellite data, drone data, and robotics data, and sensors associated to them to try to predict in a cheap and fast and reliable way changes in these states. So we are now actively working with folks from ORI here in Oxford, the Oxford Robotics Institute, to do that. So we built 2 kernels to be able to connect these 2 distributions. The first one is what we call the survival kernel. I'm going to fly through this, and you're going to forgive me in the interest of time, okay? What we do is we characterize how the size or the concentration of metabolomes or whatever have you, the signature of NDVI of an individual relates to its chance of survival on the first part at the top. Then we penalize that mortality. We take the remaining surviving individuals and we track how that state, NDVI, changes to the next year. That gives us the number and the value of individuals of AI states that have survived throughout that transition. That's going to come in here to contribute to this change. And the S, the structure, and the N, the size of the population. But of course, populations are not just about survival. They're also about reproduction, right? So we can look at how individuals may reproduce as a function of how big they are, what concentration of metabolomes they have, how healthy they're looking from an NDVI perspective, et cetera, et cetera. And then we can also look at how the amount of babies, offspring that they produce, will come back to the next year to have an I state themselves. You obtain that kernel on the top, you put it together, and you come with a stage structure model. Matrix population models might sound familiar. Another model that does this trick is called an IPM, an integral projection model. Okay. So we have a mathematical and very rigorous way of linking the structure and the size of a population through time, through how individuals in that population contribute to survival and reproduction. And what's interesting in this approach is that you can actually choose any I state that your heart and your drones and your satellites and your robots desire, so long as you identify the right one. So the right one will be the one that predicts best and for which you have data. I'm aware of data limitations as well. And in building these vital rates, these demographic processes of survival, changes in state, reproduction, you can also build in dependencies to how hot the year was, dependencies to how many neighbors you had around you, dependencies to how close to a human population you have been. So you can actually start to think about the community, which is something that historically population ecologists have not done very well. And I would also blame the community ecologists, by the way. Community ecologists have not spoken to us demographers. So the blame is to be shared equally. So let me tell you about how these tools can be deployed to address some really interesting questions. So Alice Rosen, who is currently doing a rotation with Jesus in your departments, we were working with her and with Thomas Ajaker, who's another collaborator from this department, to build an IPM of eucalyptus based on LiDAR data. So what Alice did in record time, by the way, in about 2 months, is she delineated data on eucalypts from a patch of forest in Australia. This patch of forest is mostly a monoculture. It's not quite true. There's some other species, but for the purposes of today, it's all one species, okay? And she was able to track changes in growth, shrinkage, mortality, and recruitment between 2 time steps based on the LiDAR data, and quite a lot of work and hammering her foreheads in front of the computer. In addition to that, every individual, of course, was GPS coordinated. And Thomas was very kind to give us data about dryness in the soil. So that's what we call the topographic wetness index. Blue dots correspond to drier places. Yellow areas correspond to wetter areas. And of course, we can also predict the chances of survival, growth, and reproduction of a given core individual, a target individual, based on how many conspecifics there are, say, within 10 meters or within 20 meters. But also we can do the same mathematical trick for heterospecifics. So we can look at intraspecific and interspecific competition or facilitation if the effects are positive. She compiled the demographic model, and then she ran a elasticity, which is a way to quantify how responsive you are to changes in underlying parameters. Here you have got 2 main vital rates, 2 main demographic processes, growth and survival. This growth and survival are underpinned mechanistically by an intercept, a residual slope, a quadratic term to growth, a residual on that intercept, and other things as it is survival. Interesting here, the wetness index and the degree of competition raise a really low elasticity to how long-lived on the y-axis these eucalypts are, which is the same thing to say that this population's mean longevity is quite resistant to how tough things are around it. So you could call this species quite resistant in that way, okay? We can take this machinery even farther. So we can take the distribution of a species, again, looking at the structure as a function of how big it may be, for instance, and how many individuals there are. That's the area underneath, okay? And then we can project it by that demographic model. This is an actual kernel, okay? And we can do that for as many times as our heart desires, making the assumption that the conditions upon which that model was parameterized are constant. We can also do stochastically, by the way, but for today, we'll focus on constancy. And we can project the population growth rates through time. In this case, the population has a very stable performance. We can then go on and simulate a drought. We can say the droughts tend to kill younglings or smaller things. What happens if we then reproject that population? Population enters a phase of transient dynamics, and then it goes to equilibrium. But the equilibrium that it goes into is one of lower demographic performance. We can equally simulate trophy hunting. Now I'm taking you across the tree of life, am I not? Walking from eucalypts to species exerted to droughts, now with lions, right? The gist of this is that it can apply to any creature across the tree of life. Trophy hunting targets adults. Therefore, the structure of adults goes down. And we can track what happens to the population. By the way, you will be surprised what happens with some of these disturbances. They can actually be good, quote unquote, for the population. Trophy hunting sometimes can result in positive growth through the lack of density dependence. And you can do that for as many things and simulations as your heart desires. And if you do that, what you end up with is 1,000 different projections of a simulation that together define the transient envelope. The transient envelope encompasses everything that the species could do, everything that the population could do, depending on different ways of perturbing the initial conditions. Okay? And from this, we can actually start to think about resistance, recovery, and another term, amplification. So to your left, community resilience. To your right, demographic resilience. You have got a population with a given population size, it gets hit by a disturbance. And it can either go down, it can stay as it is, so full resistance, or it can actually go up. If it goes down, it fails to resist. How far down it goes, the more it lacks resistance. Okay? If it goes up, it does what we call compensation. It compensates, takes advantage, in a way, you can think about it, of that disturbance. And eventually, the system will go back to equilibrium. So how long it takes to go back to equilibrium is a proxy to recovery time. We can quantify all of that, every single moment on that transient envelope. There's mathematical formulae that some collaborators and myself have developed. Main instigator on this is Paul Capdevila, by the way, a previous postdoc in my group. So what we now understand in terms of demographic resilience is that there's more to life than resistance and recovery. We need to think about the ability of the populations to take advantage of the disturbance. And an example of this is this out of this planet plant that I've been working with for quite a while. This is the natural range is in Cadiz, Seville, Morocco, and parts of Portugal. Home for me is right there, by the way. So they like to this gorgeous for me. And this species is fire adapted. What happens in the heathlands is that many species, when they get burned, they take a long time to recover. That's when the opportunists come in and they make the most out of it. So we can think about the three components of demographic resilience. Does a population fail to resist or not? Does it take advantage of the disturbance, so high compensation or not? And if it comes away from equilibrium, like I did with that wall and the rain, how long until your lungs are fully recovered? How long is your time to recover? These demographic frameworks really allow to link individual heterogeneity to the performance of the whole population. So work that we have been doing in my lab with Heitor Campos de Souza from Brazil has been looking at how different parameters of 3 different reptiles in the Brazilian Cerrado help predict survival and reproduction, survival and recruitment. So you have got here parameters that have to do with weather, microclimate, ecophysiology, and fire, both the intensity and the time since the last fire. The data that we have been working with is a gift. 20 years, monthly records across 5 different sites, and within each site, experimental manipulations of time since last fire. It's a gift. It's been a pleasure to work with it. So what you can see there is that the different parameters actually influence the rates of survival and the reproduction, right? You can see a little bit of variation there. What we've been able to track here is for the 3 different species is that the severity of the fire has species-specific responses to the ability of those populations to resist, take advantage of, and if they displace, quickly recover or not. You can see, for instance, that in the case of the bottom one, in Tabare, if the fire gets really, really intense, there's a non-linear decline for compensation. So at lower and medium high intensities, they tend to take advantage of it. When things get really hot, they collapse. Okay. Another example, for instance, would be the opposite one for resistance. So they tend to very poorly resist, except when intensity is really high. So this might be already triggering in your mind, wait a minute, are there some trade-offs in those components of demographic resilience? And the answer is yes. Paul Capdevila et al. Ecology Letters 2021. I knew that this map wouldn't work. So what this map is supposed to be showing to you guys is how much demographic information we have across the tree of life on various databases that we've been curating for the last, I lost the count, maybe 15 years by now, by the way. And some of the culprits are showcased here. Sam Levin, Corno Bernard, and that individual over there, Sam Gascoigne as well, have been making really a big push for what we can actually look at. Is this computer connected to the internet?
Yeah.
Could I connect to the browser to show something? Okay. So I just wanted to show, because that PDF doesn't show the dots, how many dots we actually have access to. I want to show you very quickly what some of these data are coming from. They're fully open access. If you might be able to show me the browser. Oh, is it just showing?
Coming up there.
Okay.
So you can go.
Thank you so much. So are people online able to see that as well? Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for confirming. So these are some, not all, of the resources that we have been putting together. We have got stage structured demographic information for plants and animals across those two kingdoms. And also, how do I zoom? There you go. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of an idea of the geographic coverage. I am purposefully showing you to the countries where we have more data, by the way, because there's big taxonomic and geographic biases in these databases. How wonderful is the demography of plants and animals in green and blue in Europe, not so much in Africa. Okay, so what I'm going to show you next is how you can actually upscale some of the frameworks to ask macro ecological questions. Okay. So also with Paul, we evaluated whether life history traits are good predictors of the components of demographic resilience. What is a life history trait? How long you live, when you start to reproduce, how fast you grow. All of the things that I was asking you questions about in the beginning, the Guinness World Records, those are life history traits in a way. Not every Guinness World Record is a life history trait, but everything that determines your life cycle, how long you live, how often you reproduce, how much do you reproduce, etc., etc. A key life history trait is generation time. Generation time is the mean age at which individuals in a population reproduce. What would you say is the mean generation time, the generation time of humans in the UK? Yep. About 30, yep. Yeah, with a pretty narrow window, I would actually argue on top of that. So the mean would be about that. The standard deviation will be pretty narrow. What do you think is the generation time of bristlecone pines? Now we're talking for sure more than hundreds. Yeah. So when we tend to think of ourselves as long-lived creatures, maybe think twice. So generation time is a good correlate, I will dare to say predictor, of resistance. In the plant kingdom, long-lived creatures resist more. Not so much in the animal kingdom. The response is actually the opposite. And when it comes to another demographic variable that we're really interested in, which is how much do you reproduce when you reproduce, the mean reproductive output, that is a universal good predictor of resistance. The more you reproduce, the more you resist disturbances. This is really important information because it is fundamental to macroecology, but it's also fundamental to what the UN is trying to do. If we can identify the systems that in the plant kingdom have longer longevities and are highly reproductive, you'll be able to pinpoint species that are more resistant in general. Maybe you want to choose those ones to do a restoration project. What's been interesting is that a recent publication from my group has shown that a long-held tenet is incorrect using the same data. So this is a paper led by James Kant, a recent graduate. He's now in St. Andrews as a postdoc. And what we were able to show there is there's a hypothesis that was first put forth by Holling, the founding father of resilience research. Holling predicted that species that had been exerted to more fluctuations in the environment or more disturbances in the environment would have become adapted to those and therefore be more resilient. So a species that lives in a more constant environment should have lower resilience of resistance, amplification, or compensation is the same, and recovery. And what we showed here is that that is not the case. A better predictor of demographic resilience across the animal and the plant kingdom is the taxonomic units to which they belong. So pine trees are quite resistant, but they take forever to recover. Carnivora tend to amplify. That also is critical information because it can then again help conservation management dictate their actions. So recent environmental exposure is not a good predictor of resilience. And by recent, I mean environmental information, climatic data in the last 75 years, prior to the data being collected, the demographic data being collected. What turned out to be really a good predictor of demographic resilience is how close those populations of animals and plants are found to human settlements. So this is work that master students did in my lab a few years ago that we're trying to get published now. What we did there is we worked with people who developed the human footprint database, which evaluates different actions of humans across 8 different layers around the globe. You can have, for instance, intensity on densities of cities, light pollution, amount of railways, waterways, roadways, population density, farming, and pristine ecosystems. We did a multivariate analysis to look at the variance, a PCA, this is called. There's many of them, but this is a principal component analysis. We evaluated how the first axis that has to do with human presence, so to the left, farther away from cities. To the right, closer to cities, okay? How that might be used as a correlate to demographic resilience, okay? And what you can see there is that we have got demographic information belonging to the geographic dots across the full continuum, highlighted with a black lining around it, if you can see it. So we have got populations that are really close to human settlements and populations that are really far away in reserves, in Brazil and other regions. So we did macroecological, phylogenetically corrected, body mass corrected analysis to evaluate whether resistance, recovery, and amplification or compensation correlate with human presence. And the answer is yes, in a really interesting way, actually. I want to highlight the models that are being fitted here are corrected by phylogeny, okay? And so they might not necessarily follow the overall trends. Important to these plots, each point is not independent from each other. Each point corresponds to a population within a species, but species are not independent from each other through evolution. So the lines are looking at the overall trends once you take into consideration phylogenies. And you can see here, for instance, for animals, is that the ability to take advantage of disturbances remains more or less flat as you walk into cities. But for plants, it goes down. Okay, what you can also see there, let me see if I can grab a really good example for resistance, is that as animals and plants are located closer to human settlements, they tend to be more resistant to our disturbances. And what we have done as a follow-up analysis is evaluate the loss of diversity. So what this paper seems to, what our analysis seems to suggest is that the reason that resistance increases as we walk closer to cities is not that that's actually a biologically meaningful pattern. It's more that there's been a loss of diversity of those species that were not resilient. So the species that lack resistance were wiped out probably hundreds of years ago. But of course, not all animals are created equally. All plants are sessile. But some animals have the ability to migrate. Plants only have got those three responses. You either resist, or you and if you don't, you recover, or you take advantage of it. Some animals can flee before adversity. The signals vary as well when we take into consideration animal species that can move around more than 50K, high mobility, or not, in a way that actually makes sense if you take a look at it. For instance, species with low mobility, I would argue, have been selected to show higher resistance than species with high mobility as they walk, quote unquote, closer to cities, because they need to. The high mobility species can migrate, even on a daily basis. So together, the research that I have attempted to present today shows why maths is useful. I want to highlight, I did not get a background, I did not get an education in maths. Maths came into my life as a consequence of my questions. It was never the end. It has become the mean. State structure demographic models really can help us link individuals to populations. And when you build these models in a way that take into consideration drought or heterotrophic or homotrophic competition and relationships, then you can start to think about the community interactions. This novel framework then takes into account the reality that not all disturbances are created equally, and some disturbances can actually be good for the ecological systems. And last but not least, the fact that we finally can integrate physiology, behavior, life history traits, and human actions in terms of how natural populations respond to disturbances. How am I doing on the time, Jatinder?
10 minutes.
Awesome. So then I'll tell you. So this has been part of my lab in the last, when I say 5 years, and then a few rejections came along when I was attempting to expand this research portfolio. But finally, a grant was successful, and so we got a Pushing the Frontiers grant through NERC that will start in October, and so I'm going to have a mathematical postdoc joining the team to expand the framework. This current mathematical framework does what it does, I would argue, quite well, but only for one kind of disturbance. And that is a pulse disturbance. Disturbances happen once, and then the system goes. But that's not how disturbances really happen, right, across the planet. So we're really interested in developing the mathematics and solving analytical solutions to provide a tool set to ecologists and conservation biologists, whereby if you have got demographic information, thanks to Compadre, Comadre, Padrino, other databases, and you know the type of disturbance regime that your system is currently under or will potentially become affected by, then you can start to make meaningful ecological forecast predictions. That's one. And the other thing is to really upscale to the community level. I'm currently looking for a postdoc. So if you're interested in any of those questions, please come see me 2 buildings away from you. So part of what we're going to be doing is actually taking advantage of a worldwide ecological network, which is DRAGNet, the Disturbance and Resource Across Global Grasslands Network. This network evaluates 2 different kinds of disturbances and their interaction: mechanical disturbances and chemical disturbances on grasslands responses, right? And so you can see, for instance, mechanical disturbance that every node within the framework is doing in August. So we have a mechanical disturbance where we pretty much kill every single blade of grass within our plots. We have got another type of treatment, which is a chemical disturbance, and their interaction as well. And this has been done across a lot of nodes, as you can see on that map. And the hope then is to be able to be everywhere at the same time. Well, that's impossible. What's also impossible is for me to push my demographic integrative agenda onto all of the PIs across this network. As convincing as my accent might sound, doesn't work that way. So what we are really interested in doing is taking shortcuts. Introducing Hulk. Hulk is a land mower converted into an autonomous robotics unit that was developed by Nick Haas and his team at the Oxford Robotics Institute. Hawk is currently collecting data up in White and Woods, and in collaboration also with a lot of folks and postdocs and PhD students in my group, we're developing methods that allow us to not even have to touch the species to identify them. So there's a lot of really exciting developments in my group at the moment, trying to identify species or at least functional forms from NDVI data, hyperspectral data, and LiDAR. An example of which was given before when I talked about the fantastic job that Alice Rosen did during the rotation. It's a really complex and multidimensional world, ecological resilience. And in an effort to try to contribute and try to make sense of it, we wrote a special feature across 3 journals of the BES. And that's the editorial. I'm really happy and very proud of that editorial because it's not a simple 2-page editorial that tells you what every paper has been doing. It attempts to set an agenda for where we should be within 10 years. So if you're interested in the field of ecological resilience, I'll be very keen to discuss that paper with you. And on that note, I will thank you and leave you there. Cheers. Yes.
Just a random question. You showed that map where you were investigating whether environment predicts resilience.
Was it
There,
this one?
there,
Yep.
yes.
Yep.
And I was just wondering, surely one of the interesting predictors would just be whether the environment is prone to top kill or not. So if you just plotted fire frequency or herbivory, surely that's just a really neat predictor.
We haven't actually looked at that just yet. So I would love to pick your brain in terms of how to best do that. There's been a few papers also. So I've been having chats with Erin Sopp to look at deep time resilience. We now know that the phylogeny matters, which maybe sets the agenda for looking at what kinds of disturbance regimes were there millennia ago, and whether that that to me sounds like dark magic, by the way, deep time resilience. But there you go. But also making sense of the diversity of disturbances and maybe come up with a series of tangible disturbance archetypes almost, right? And trying to do something microecological. That'd be wonderful. So very keen to chat with you later. Thank you.
Thanks for the very interesting talk. I was just wondering, have you tried to investigate the resilience in spatial system?
In what, sorry?
A spatial system, in a spatial ecosystem. Because
sorry, I'm not hearing you very well. This is just acoustic. So do you mean spatial or spatial?
Spatial.
Spatial. So yeah, actually, so one of the things that we're doing now with Tama, that guy, and Paul and other collaborators from CNRS is evaluating intra-specific level resilience. So these plots have the power of macroecology at the species level. The databases that we have collated are a reflection of the state of the art in demography. And the state of the art in demography is most people don't look at multiple populations within one species, right? There are some multiple populations within these plots, by the way, but we have gotten a hand of 2 study species, a plant and a frog, for which we have got high resolution demographic data for over 50 populations, the frog across Europe and the plant across the globe. And so we're redoing this analysis with more fine-tuned genomics data as well to be able to decompose that. Does that answer your question? Is that what you meant? Yeah, so again, if you're interested in, very keen to discuss later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the talk. So my question would be how you choose or formalize the stage structure model, because the stage is very complex issue. Like for some trees, you have some different stage like seedling, sapling, and adult trees. And sometimes you get a lot of seedlings, which when I go to the forest, I see a lot of seedlings just fall off the ground. But after a few years, due to the light competition, a lot of seedlings just die.
Yeah.
So just an example, like if you choose seedling as a stage in your model, that doesn't mean that that really contributes to the overall dynamics of the the population dynamics. So I was on
Absolutely. Yep.
like there's no rule of thumb of choosing the model.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for that question. So that question is one of model selection, really, and I have got two answers for that. One, I can tell you what the scientific discipline, what population ecologists do, and we take advantage of that. And then I can tell you what I, as a single person, do when I go out to the field. So first, what other ecologists do. We follow the rule of author knows best. So we collect demographic information that has gone through peer review, right? We archive that information into Compadre, Comadre, Mosaic, and Padrino. They're all fully open access. By the way, Mosaic just came out a few days ago, fully open access. Within each publication, we deem that the author is intimately acquainted with the biology of the species. Having said that, some of the analysis that I presented here have got between 300 and 500 plant or animal species. In reality, we have got access to thousands. And so the question is, why do you not use the thousands? Because we come out with a set of really rigorous criteria, given the type of questions that we want to address. So we hope that author knows best, but we don't go blind with that. That's the short of it. And that's a pretty long answer, but I'm happy to continue later if you want. Then what I do when I go to the field and when my team goes to the field is the first and the second year are really, really tough, because we measure everything that we suspect could potentially predict survival and reproduction. And by the way, because the collection of those data is so difficult, that's what's motivated me, call me lazy if you will, to try to shortcut that with drones and satellites and robots, right? But the first few years is all about getting to know your species really, really well, and then building models that continually update year after year. By the third year, I know exactly what I need to continue collecting, and everything else I drop.
Hi, thank you. I had a question. So how do you establish the relevant timescale for the different objects studied, especially when you are comparing different things like plants and animals, and then they have different, yeah, like how do you establish a relevant timescale, and then especially when you are comparing kind of objects of study?
So the vast majority of the data that we have is set on an annual basis, but not all of it. There's a bias within population ecology to evaluate the demography of things that are not extremely long-lived. I wish we had good Bristol-Compine data, by the way, we don't. Or really short-lived. So we tend to work with animals that live somewhere between 5 to 20 years and plants that live between 2 to like maybe 100 years, right? Yeah. There's something to be said about expanding that horizon. That's more of a research agenda for the whole discipline than for myself. Because the vast majority of the models that have been published are parameterized on an annual basis. The time component is universal across them. We actually have developed algorithms to back convert things, so we can actually modify the models to work on the basis of months or years or decades. But if we want to go beyond decades, we run out of statistical power very fast, because we don't have a lot of very long recorded studies. Another limitation of the discipline.
Yeah. Okay. Because I had another question kind of related to that. Is like when you're studying, perhaps studying ecosystems, I don't know, or things are very complex, how do you establish a stable state, that something is in a stable state, especially if you lack the data in a long time, no? And then... The
classical approaches have to look with looking at the dominant. Let me know if you want a more biologically inclined answer. I'm happy to. But the current approaches have to do with assuming that the systems will go back to stationarity and evaluating the portfolio of the dominant eigenvalue of a system, be that the physiology of an organism, the demography of a population, or the richness of a community. But what I'm actually going to be doing next is using a whole different branch of physics called pseudospectral theory that does not make that assumption that systems go back to equilibrium, or that they're not at equilibrium either to start with. That has to do with decompositions of the second and third eigenvalue, by the way.
Hiya. So when you're in that graph behind you, there's this human presence thing that's being measured. Like, how is that actually measured? How is it determined that humans are highly active or not somewhere? Is like something like farmland that's far away from a city, how is that, how like disturbed is that considered to be?
That might be a question from my colleague Moreno Di Marco, who's the lead of or our co-leads on that database. Yeah.
They just have a lot of spatial data on distance to the roads.
Yeah.
Distance from different intensities of produce a global map.
Yeah. And they have for each layer, they have a score from 1 to 8, I think. And then you can actually derive products that look at just one layer or a few layers or the whole index if you want. Depends on what you're interested in.
I was curious to, that was really interesting. I was curious to know a bit more about the Hulk. So are you trying to capture plant traits at high frequency through that? And how effective is it proving? Are you able to find, what traits are you capturing?
It's taken us a long time for us to get there, by the way, but that is for the Hulk to be able to autonomously direct itself, right? We did some preliminary data analysis in a publication last year where we showed that various moments of multispectral images predict biodiversity. So that was done from drones. But whether done from drones or from robots is irrelevant. Really what matters is that something, not us, is doing that autonomously, and that it can have the cameras or the sensors that we're interested in. So Hulk has not yet been used to do those type of correlations, but week 7 next week, week 8, week 9, we all go and become best friends with Hulk, and we're going to be doing ground truthing in terms of the botanizing, the data that we get when we do it hardcore, knees on the ground and brushes in your hands and sunscreen and dehydration, versus when the drone or the robot does it, right? So
what traits are you picking up? It's hyperspectral, you probably know.
It's hyperspectral. We've got LiDAR, multispectral as well, and of course within that RGB. And the traits that we're more interested in at the anatomic level are SLA and plant height as well. We can also pick it up from the height of the robots. But then I've got a postdoc, Erola, and another postdoc man who's in the room who are really interested in the physiology of the organisms and biochem. And Marcel, a master's student, is doing a fantastic job at spending half his life out in the field, collecting leaf samples, going back to the lab, doing a lot of extractions for nitrogen contents and phosphorus contents and other so-called functional, you know, my pet peeve with the word functional traits. We want to really evaluate whether those traits can help us predict demographic rates and identify species.
There's a question online, and then I'll come to you if that's all right. This is just from Andy Hector.
Oh, lovely.
Regarding mechanisms of resilience, he says, hi. How do you think the demographic approaches you have presented link up with the work from Leroux, Tillman et al., where their insurance and portfolio hypotheses propose that asynchrony in population fluctuations in diverse communities of species stabilizes ecosystem level productivity? I hope I did okay there, Andy.
That's a multi-part question with a multi-part answer. So first of all, thank you, Andy. Second of all, I failed to mention that Andy Hector and a colleague in another university, Ian Stott, are involved in this grant that begins in October. And I'm blessed to be able to bring a community ecology such as Andy to be able to make sense of that mess. The way in which I approach the storage effect and other ideas put forward by Tillman et al. Is by evaluating the ability of different species to respond to environmental stochasticity, which hasn't been done before. So we're really interested in matching responses such as demographic buffering. There is the ability to remain put. PhD student in my group uses the really nice analogy of a chemical buffer, right? So you can throw anything at the species and it doesn't vary from its strategy. So it shows a high degree of resilience. We have got mathematical ways of quantifying demographic buffering, as we do as well with the other strategy, which is called liability, demographic liability. deep inside, I think that what Tillman was thinking about when he was coming out with those ideas was whether species can vary or not, and whether they all do it synchronously or not. I suspect that they don't, that there's a bit of an insurance support for the insurance hypothesis, that when a disturbance happens, some of them go, but then functionally similar species take over. So that's also part of what we hope to be able to answer in that grant. But obviously, Andy, I know where you work and I know where you live, so you can fill me in if you disagree.
He's smiling. Feel free to unmute if you want, Andy. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Oh, he's here. I can see him.
Yeah.
Hi,
It's on
Andy.
the screen.
Yeah, sorry not to be there in person, Rob. So as you know, I was at the field trying to organize the
No
way for
worries.
the Hulk to be able to get between our plots. Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much, Rob. Fantastic. And sorry not to be there in person.
Not a worries, and thank you for going to the field.
Thank you, Rob. I wanted to see where you sit on something, because a lot of population ecology has been using what we've done in structured demography to look at resilience, and kind of everyone's pitching this holy grail of linking that to community ecology. Do you think we're kind of going down a massive alleyway we can't come back from when we want to actually build these community resilience metrics? Or do you think it's going to be actually doable with real data?
I think it's gonna take a lot of work. It's gonna take 4 years, 2 postdocs, Ian Stott, Andy Hector, and £1 million. Thank you, Nerk.
Okay.
No, that was a bit of a facetious answer. What's playing against us really is the fact that community ecology and population ecology do not integrate. I mean, I know very few people who think demographically and have got a training in community ecology, and vice versa, right? So for me, for instance, I'm not free of that sin, by the way. For me, for instance, it's only been when I was forced to write a big grant, a ERC that didn't get funded, that I really became hopefully deeply acquainted with some of the classics in community ecology. And what was deeply shocking to me is the fact that even though we don't talk to each other, we've all been making the same assumptions. Community ecologists assume that systems are at equilibrium and that they do go back to equilibrium. So even though we are acquainted with ecological resilience and unstable state theory, deeply ingrained, implicit to their narrative is engineering resilience. Population ecology does the same thing, but we just call it different. We call it population growth rate. We call it stationary population growth rate, long-term population growth rate. And you've heard me, of course, complain about how we should just kill that concept because populations never go to equilibrium. So I think that it's going to take a bit of creativity. It's going to take quite a bit of postdoc and PI support, and it's going to take a lot of arguments because, you know, there's been arguments for the last 30 years. I'm sure that the arguments will continue. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you, Rob.
Good.
One more. Andy's question maybe think from my perspective as an ecosystem ecologist about the roles that the biophysical feedbacks play in resilience. So if you take a forest and you chop down half the trees, you change the microclimate, and so the environmental dependencies of the species, the changes from what would perhaps occur in the intact forest. And so how, I'm sure you can, in this framework, how can you bring in biophysical feedback so the structure of the system ends up changing the nature of the sensitivity to the environment?
Let me see if I can go back to the framework for just a tiny second. I can kind of pinpoint where I think that will go.
Mm.
Okay, so this is always obviously the bare bone version of the framework, where we are predicting. Let me see if I can actually point it. Can you see the mouse here?
Yeah.
All right, so we are predicting survival as a function of a state variable. Call that size, if you will. Call that canopy area, if you will, for a second. Okay. Then we are predicting change in canopy area the next time unit, call that the next year, based on how big that canopy for every individual is the previous year. You put those two together and you come up with the kernel of changes in size of canopy conditional on having survived. Okay. Then down here you have got the probability or the number of offsprings being produced and then the size of those offspring, right? This is a really simplistic framework. In fact, what Alice did, for instance, is she modeled juveniles using one eye state, that being sapling height, and the adults using adult area. So you can actually, you don't have to choose one eye state. In fact, I did justice to that by saying any characteristic or characteristics. And within that, you can actually model with mixed effect models, for instance, survival, changes in size, probability of producing X amount of babies, offspring, saplings, and the size of those saplings with covariates. Those covariates can happen at the individual level, or it can happen at the whole population / community level. So I think that those type of perhaps large scale modifications will happen at the whole population, the whole community level. But it might be also that they are region specific within the community, that perhaps there's an interaction between being quite close to the water table and being able to escape from a drought, for instance, right? So it's all through the very basic tool sets of linear models, really, which is something that ecologists have become acquainted quite a lot in the last 20 years. So it might sound like dark magic, but it's just a battery of linear models, really, with mixed effects if you want to add them.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very
Thanks so much.
fascinating. And we have drinks at the back, so feel free to everyone to linger and have casual conversation.
Thank you so much for help. I will have come home with that.